Well, welcome to another Pastor's Vlog. This is Pastor Scott Bashoor, and today we're going to be looking at Psalm 91. Psalm 91 is a passage which I was able to begin studying this past Sunday, preaching this past Sunday morning, and the Lord willing will continue to preach it, finish it this next coming Sunday. But this week I'd like us to take a little sidebar and consider how this passage, which deals with how believers are protected from things like the plague, is a passage which itself is plagued by misunderstanding. So join in with me as we consider a little bit of the meaning and relevance of Psalm 91. Psalm 91 is a passage which is filled with precious verses like verse 1, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty." And verse 4, "He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge." In addition to precious verses like that, there are at least 4 references to being protected by plague. And it's these in particular which are often misappropriated, misunderstood, and misapplied. They're things like verse 10, "No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent." And these days, during the coronavirus outbreak, these verses have become proof texts for some to claim that if you have enough faith, that you can be protected from any kind of outbreak without human intervention. Well, we want to consider today some key issues in understanding, appreciating, and applying these precious kinds of verses. We'll consider firstly interpreting in the original contexts, and then in another vlog we'll consider how to make careful and prayerful application to the Christian life. First, we'll talk about original contexts. And I've intentionally said contexts because there are really layers of context that are important to understand in appreciating this passage. We have to begin with the purposes. Why was it that the Spirit of God led the psalmist to write this poem? What were the circumstances behind it? And what is the ongoing relevance to God's people? It would appear that this psalm is something of a pre-battle song. There are references throughout the poem that speak of warfare, enemies attacking at night, arrows flying by day, huge death counts, thousands dying, tens of thousands dying, and even the reference to plagues. This was commonly a problem in military camps where people would be bivouacked for periods of time. So what might be taking place is that a commander or a king has come to the temple to pray, to seek God's face, to seek help. And he there receives prophetic encouragement, perhaps from a priest or a Levite, one who would become the psalmist, who would then record those words for future use, for the edification of the posterity. There are a number of psalms like this that describe one-off events that were memorable, but not necessarily repeatable. Psalm 118 is an example of that, where there's an individual who had won a great battle, though he thought he was going to die, and he comes to the temple and he knocks on the door, as it were, and says, "Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may go into them." And the crowd receives him with cheers, celebrating that this is the day that the Lord has made, and that rock-like commander who had been rejected by the foreign powers comes and gives his thank offering and binds it to the horns of the altar. Now that describes a single event in Israel's history, and yet the words go on to have relevance. Jesus fulfills those words, not as a prophecy, but as a type, as the greater one. That event was immortalized in song and continued to inspire trust and thanks, though there were details about it that were limited to that one event. And I think Psalm 91 is this way as well. There are elements of it that relate to that single event. Another part of the purposes to consider is the proverbial encouragement that's given. The psalmist knew that future generations would read it, and it's interesting that the wording that is filled in verses 3 through 18 is similar to words that we find in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 21 to 26, Solomon is encouraging his son to continue to walk in the way of wisdom because there is protection in that sort of living. He says, for instance, chapter 3, verse 24, "Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence, and will keep your foot from being caught." Now that is generally true wisdom, but one thing we know about the Proverbs is that they are not airtight promises. There are exceptions to them. There are examples of people like Job, for instance. And that brings us now to our next area of original context and considering other passages, contrasting passages. Even closer than the book of Job is Psalm 90. Psalm 90, perhaps the first psalm written by Moses, has been strategically placed with Psalm 91, written in two different eras, and two different perspectives on the experiences of God's people. In Psalm 90, Moses is lamenting over the harsh wilderness years that the Israelites experienced. Life is short and hard, and yet God is still their dwelling place. God is still their refuge. As Moses will say in Psalm 90, verse 1, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, using language that is similar to Psalm 91, verse 1. So these two psalms placed side by side are a reminder that neither one of those poems completely describes all of the experiences of God's people. We have to think about other witnesses in Scripture. I've mentioned Job already in the book right next to the Psalms, a man who could not have avoided the sickness and the suffering he went through prayer or claiming of verses, because he was appointed for that particular trial. Jeremiah, the prophet, the righteous prophet, suffered along with Judah under the Babylonian invasion. Jeremiah thrown deep into the pit. Jeremiah aged and infirm. He could not escape those things by claiming something like Psalm 91, which he would have already known. And then in the Christian era, there were the martyrs who were faithful and full of faith. They did not endure for the sake of Christ because they were failing to hold on to some promise of Psalm 91. No, their obedience led them into the path of suffering as well. So passages like Psalm 91, as encouraging as they are, need to be held in tension with the other contexts of Scripture. So we've considered about interpreting an original context, and much more could be said about it. But next time we meet, we'll talk about how to make prayerful and careful application to the Christian life. It's telling that this passage, Psalm 91, is only quoted once directly in the New Testament, and it's quoted by Satan, who misapplies it as some kind of an airtight promise to Jesus. So we'll look at that next time and think about ways that we can honor the Lord in the way that we appreciate this beautiful portion of God's holy word. Thank you for watching, and we'll look forward to being together again soon.